Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for our webinar hosted by the Chicago Police Department. My name is Marcia Thompson. I'm going to be moderating this webinar this evening. For those who have not met me in previous webinars, I am a civil rights attorney and a consultant to the City of Chicago on community engagement and reform. Tonight's webinar is about Chicago Police Department's human rights policy and its prohibition regarding racial profiling and other bias-based policing policies. Throughout the evening, you'll hear from various members of the Chicago Police Department leadership team, and they will discuss current policies and invite you to provide your input on some of the various mechanisms we have for you to give input. Following the presentation, we'll ask that our CPD members answer some questions that may have been posed earlier or throughout the registration process or tonight's webinar. We'll ask that if you have a question tonight during the webinar, that you put it in the chat. We will try our best to make sure that we answer as many questions as possible. Tonight's webinar is being recorded and will be made publicly available for everyone to watch at a later time. The webinar is posted on Chicago Police Department's YouTube page, as well as on the department's website. We also joined by American Sign Language interpreter. So if anyone needs to have the interpreter, please spotlight them now. Once we start sharing the screen, that person, you may be more difficult to locate the sign language interpreter. If you need the interpreter, we encourage you again to pin them now. To pin the interpreter, please screen by clicking on the button with the 3 dots at the top right of the interpreter's window, and you'll be able to pin that individual. Before we go into tonight's presentation, we do have our superintendent here this evening, David Brown, who will give some welcoming comments. So with that, I welcome Superintendent David Brown.
Thank you, Marcia, and thank you, team. First of all, thank you for the time you're spending in this webinar. I really appreciate that you're investing your time into our department, ensuring that we make good on our promise to reform. And we are serious about reform. I took this job 18 months ago as police superintendent to transform this police department using the consent decree as a guide. And so policies are more than just print on paper. It's the guideposts that we're using to bring the print to life and really transform this police department to become the department that every person in Chicago deserves. And we're also quite serious in our engaging with the public in our policy development to ensure not only accountability to the community, but to also ensure that we're doing all we can to listen to what the public is saying they want us to become and how we become that. So this webinar obviously is focused on human rights and prohibition of racial profiling policies, but it's much more than that. It's an opportunity for us to listen to the public, for you to guide us in our reformation, and for us to make listening a part of our policy development to ensure that we are doing all we can to be the police department this city deserves. So with that, thank you again for your time, and I'll turn it back over to Marcia.
Thank you, Superintendent. We really appreciate you joining us this evening. So throughout the evening, we're going to have different panelists. And as I mentioned, please put any of your questions in the chat. We will try to answer those at the end of the webinar. And there are a couple of questions that we received early on that I will try to pose to our panelists if they don't address your question during their presentation. This is a part of our engagement series. And later on, one of our speakers will talk more about opportunities to get involved in community engagement, but this is one of the vehicles that is a part of the overall CPD engagement process. So with that, I will bring up our next speaker, and that is going to be Executive Director Bob Boyd, who will talk a little bit about the background of our consent decree here in Chicago.
Thank you, Marcia, and good evening, everyone. As the superintendent said, we're very happy to have you this evening. I'm going to go over a little bit of background on the consent decree, as well as what some of the requirements of the consent decree are and the path forward in terms of community engagement. So starting with some background on the consent decree itself. The consent decree is a negotiated settlement between the City of Chicago and the Office of the Attorney General, and it is overseen by a federal judge, Judge Robert Dow. The consent decree is the most extensive of its kind in the modern era of consent decrees. Over 200 pages long, 799 paragraphs, approximately 566 individual deliverables. And some of the reforms are obviously guided by deadlines. The consent decree remains in place until the City of Chicago is deemed to be in full and effective compliance. So what that means is we just received our year 2 report from the monitor, and in looking at other cities around the country and the length of time it takes or has taken them from the beginning of the consent decree to the end, the approximate average of those jurisdictions being under consent decree is about 12 years. The Chicago just completed year 2, and we have made pretty steady progress, particularly in the last year, going from 48 paragraphs with some level of compliance to now 266. The court has appointed an independent monitor to oversee our progress on the consent decree itself. That independent monitor is Maggie Hickey, and her team is required to regularly report out on the city's compliance toward the consent decree, as well as conduct reviews and audits, and review and approve or provide no objections to the various policies that are required to be developed under the consent decree itself. So looking a little deeper into the consent decree requirements, particularly as it pertains to policy, the consent decree requires that CPD in particular ensure that our policies and practices prohibit discrimination on the basis of any protected class as defined under federal, state, and local law. In addition, the consent decree requires that all CPD members, all members of the Chicago Police Department, interact with members of the public in an unbiased, fair, and respectful manner. It requires that we refrain from using language or taking action to taunt or denigrate an individual. And it prohibits officers from using a number of factors such as backgrounds and identities when making routine or spontaneous law enforcement decisions. So just a little bit of additional background on the 2 policies that we're talking about here tonight. CPD currently has policy in place, both with respect to human rights and with respect to a prohibition on racial profiling. Our human rights policy was last updated in October 2017, and our prohibition against racial profiling was last updated in December of 2017, which is why we are now coming forward and seeking input on a refreshed version of those policies. Both policies require members of the Chicago Police Department to not exhibit any racial profiling or other biases based on a variety of factors. And they require us to work with the various communities of Chicago to safeguard lives and property and to ensure that all persons enjoy the fundamental human rights. So looking at our process that we are going to go through, our draft policies are now up for public comment on our website, and they will remain up for comment through January 28th of 2022. Our process typically is after the comment process concludes or the public engagement process concludes. So it's more than just the public comment process. It's this webinar that we're going through. It includes it can include deliberative dialogues or other events throughout the city. We will make revisions to both policies based on the feedback we received. And once those policies are revised based on the feedback, we will reshare those drafts with the public and post them for an additional public comment period. Both policies will need to be reviewed by the independent monitoring team in the Office of the Attorney General. And we obviously, when we do that, we seek a no objection. If there are objections, we will work out those differences and until we do ultimately receive a no objection. And once the policies are finalized, they will be implemented, and that will include a round of training. There are multiple ways in which we train on new policy. It could be anything from what we are referred to as an e-learning or learning via the internet. It could be classroom learning or roll call training. I will say for the policies that are currently in effect, we have done implicit bias training as well as 3 rounds of procedural justice training that was developed in conjunction with the Anti-Defamation League. And where we are going to in the future is to not necessarily have standalone courses, but to ensure that those principles are embedded throughout the training we conduct in the Chicago Police Department, whether that be use of force or community policing or some other topic. And then finally, we will generate a public report that details the feedback we received and the changes we made to the policies as a result of that feedback. So with that, Marcia, I will turn it back to you.
All right, thank you, Edie Boyk. I've got one question for you. So you just outlined those policies and the training, but there was one question about what happens if officers don't follow the policies. Are there, what's the procedures around that?
So as we speak of these policies tonight, we're talking about them as quote unquote policies, but what they become in the Chicago Police Department are orders. And orders are obviously taken very seriously. Not only, are we talking about orders that someone might receive from their supervisor, but we're talking about conduct and standards of professional conduct that all officers need to conduct themselves in a certain way. And what happens when a member is accused of not conducting themselves in a certain way, a complaint is generated, and then that complaint is investigated and ultimately adjudicated. And if after that investigation, an officer is found to have violated the policy or the order, if you will, then there is discipline attached to that violation. The discipline can have a substantial range depending upon what the violation is. So a lesser infraction will be a more minor penalty, whereas a severe infraction could be up to and including termination.
All right, well, thank you so much. And appreciate your time, and stay on later for questions. Thank you, Edie Boyk.
Thank you.
Next, we have Lieutenant Kapistanik, who's going to give us a little more of a deeper dive into some of the policies. Lieutenant Kapistanik.
Thank you, Marcia. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Kapistanik. I'm a lieutenant currently assigned as the commanding officer of the Policy and Procedure section of CPD's Research and Development Division. Our unit has the responsibility for the creation, publication, and management of CPD directives and policies. I want to thank you for the opportunity tonight to present this and for you taking the time to be involved in this engagement process. I look forward to the continuing engagement and the conversations around these CPD policies. As we talk today, there's 2 policies we want to go over today. The first one is General Order 201. It's our Human Rights and Human Resources policy. This is kind of the foundation of our interactions with the public policy. It sets forth our policy, procedures, and guidelines governing human rights, and defines the responsibilities of our members concerning these laws and concerning the interactions with the public on a daily basis. The second policy is our prohibition regarding racial profiling and other bias-based policing. This policy defines proper treatment of all persons by department members and specifically outlines the prohibition against racial profiling and bias-based policing. As the executive director said, we currently have policies in place on these two topics, and we want to reinforce those policies and enhance those policies. So currently, our human rights and human resources policy provides the guiding principles for our interactions with the public. These two policies, and this one in particular, focus on the foundational standards of CPD's commitment to impartial policing, including the guiding principles for every CPD officer to follow. And they follow these during every community interaction, and we provide standards for constitutional policing. This policy in particular identifies a commitment to observing, upholding, and enforcing all laws relating to individuals' rights. Department members must respect and protect each person's human rights and treat all persons with courtesy, dignity, and respect. We expect our officers to act, speak, and conduct themselves in a professional manner and maintain a courteous and professional attitude during every interaction. We prohibit officers from engaging in racial profiling or other bias-based policing. We also prohibit officers from having a condescending attitude or directing any derogatory terms or language towards any person in any manner. This policy also identifies current laws and individual rights, such as the Illinois Human Rights Act and the Chicago Human Rights Ordinance, to make sure officers are aware and follow these specific laws and statutes. And then we require officers to adhere to our limited English proficiency policy, which is a separate policy, but it identifies a requirement to make sure that communication with people with limited English proficiency, and there's interpreters and translators available for those interactions. We are currently revising these policies, not only based on the requirements that the executive director talked about in the consent decree, but also based on current research and our review of best practices in law enforcement from across the country. So some of the revisions we have identified in our draft, and the executive director talked about the training and the commitment the department has made to procedural justice and legitimacy. It's going to be a core of this policy. The core policy of procedural justice and legitimacy, about offering community members a voice, being trustworthy, all those concepts are now embedded in this policy. We also expect our officers to have the highest degree of ethical behavior and professional conduct at all times during all interactions. We also refined our policy and prohibition on language, and we included the prohibition on taking action or using language that's intended to taunt or denigrate, and using racist or derogatory language. We wanted to make sure this was clear and specific in our policies so that the prohibition was easily identifiable. We also want to have our officers correctly identify themselves by name, rank, and star number whenever they're asked by a member of the public, to ensure accountability and to ensure transparency. This policy also permits members of the public to photograph and record our officers in the performance of their duties when there's no expectation of privacy. And then violations of this policy will be reported, initiated, and investigated consistent with our current complaint and disciplinary policies. And discipline, which may include up to separation from the department, may be administered for any type of misconduct. The second policy we're going to talk about today is our prohibition regarding racial profiling. This current policy expressly prohibits racial profiling or other bias-based policing. Officers may not use race, ethnicity, color, national origin, ancestry, religion, and a number of other factors in their enforcement in making routine or spontaneous law enforcement decisions, with the only exception being if that characteristic was specifically identified in a description of a wanted person. Department members on their own are responsible to report any violation of this policy or any discrimination or any racial profiling to a department supervisor to initiate a complaint investigation. Those supervisors must follow our complaint and disciplinary policy in reporting that information to COPA and documenting that incident completely. We also in this policy identify our training, not only for recruits, but also our in-service training for officers on these policies. And then we have an administrative review process to ensure we remain committed to these policies and we are adhering to the policies that are set forth in this directive. The current revisions we're making are including immigration status and homelessness status into the characteristics on the prohibition for bias-based policing. Not only are we adding those as characteristics, but we're also adding that substitutes or stereotypes to these categories, the demographic categories such as manner of dress, mode of transportation, language ability. That's also prohibited. Using those stereotypes or substitutes in replace of those characteristics is prohibited in making those law enforcement decisions. And again, consistent with our human rights policy, we want the language to be clear in our policies that officers are prohibited from using language or taking action intended to taunt or denigrate or using racist or derogatory language. We've also expanded the definition of what a routine or spontaneous law enforcement decision is to include calls for service, interactions with witnesses, issuing citations and searches on top of investigatory stops, traffic stops, and arrests. And to ensure that we're consistent with the spirit and the guiding principles of the consent decree, we are continually administratively reviewing this policy, reviewing our actions, and engaging the public when we're doing these policy reviews to ensure that we're reflective of the needs and concerns of the community. The current policies are available right now at CPD's Department Directive System, which is at directives.chicagopolice.org. All of our current policies are publicly posted there. These are included on that website. The current revised drafts of these policies will be available tomorrow on CPD's reform website. And what we're going to do is we're going to make sure on our directives website that there's a link to that site so that you'll be directed to make those comments there. With that, I turn it back over to you, Marcia, if there's any questions.
I do have a couple of questions for you before we go on to the next section. So one of the questions is, you touched on it a little bit, but what in the department's policy illustrates how officers are to interact with people from the transgender community? Is there anything in policy specific to that or in your use of force policies?
Absolutely, that's a great question. Thank you for that. And this is a question we get frequently about CPD's policies. When we're looking at our policies and we're looking at the specific circumstances that you talked about interactions with the transgender community or use of force, we can't look at those policies in a vacuum or a silo. All of our policies are layered upon each other, and officers are bound to comply with all the policies. The two policies that we're focusing on today, in particular, the human rights policy, is a foundational standard of our commitment to impartial policing and the guiding principles we want all officers to engage in all circumstances. So layered upon that are those other policies. They will build upon that. But we want to build a strong foundation with this policy about respect, about dignity, about courteous treatment, about professionalism within any interaction, whether it's a community function, request for assistance, or a criminal investigation. All policies will then have this foundation to build on, and they will build upon that when we talk about those other policies, in particular, the transgender community, use of force, and other policies.
Okay, well, I think you may have answered it with that question, but let me ask it because it was asked from the audience. This is similar, but it's particularly to our ADA community, children with special needs, young adults, or an adult or a child that might be nonverbal. Is there any special policies around ADA or around special needs, verbal or nonverbal adults?
Absolutely. Thanks again for the question. And actually, this is a perfect example on how these conversations and how these community interactions and this engagement benefits both CPD and the community. We have this focus in some of our other policies. We've had this discussion about use of force and about the interactions there with those with intellectual or developmental disabilities, about taking an individual assessment with what's going on, understanding what's going on in those circumstances, taking visual cues from what's going on. We've identified that in training. That's been a focal point of our training as well, about people experiencing autism and things of that nature. So we've had these conversations. We're trying to embed that calculus in the officer's head as they're making those determinations in our policies. The consent decree also requires us to implement policies specific to the disabled community and people living with disabilities, including developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, autism, dementia, mobility devices, hearing loss, things of that nature. And we're in the process of building those policies out. We're in the process of building that training out as well. So conversations like this, providing that sort of feedback, helps guide us in developing those policies to make sure that the policies that we ultimately create and that we ultimately implement have the input with people from lived experience. And we can help ensure that we're drafting these policies that respond to the concerns, but also reflect the experiences the community is having. So we've had some of these conversations already, and we continue to have them as we move forward in this policy development.
All right, thank you, Lieutenant. That's the only questions I have for you. And stay on. We'll have some for you later. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Next, we have up our Deputy Chief, Navalis, who's going to talk about community engagement. So welcome, Deputy Chief Navalis.
Thank you, Marcia, and good evening to everybody. My name is Angel Navalis, and I'm the Deputy Chief of the Office of Community Policing. I'd like to first welcome everybody tonight, like the Superintendent said, to this webinar on the Chicago Police Department's Human Rights Policy and Prohibition of Racial Profiling Policy. And like the Superintendent, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here with us. We recognize as a department that in order for us to make real, meaningful, and positive change, we need the help and partnership of members of the community. So tonight, we welcome you and all the residents of the city to learn about these two important policies and invite you to review them and share with us some of your suggestions for how you believe these policies could be revised. Our goal in providing an opportunity for community input when revising these policies is to ensure that CPD has an open, accessible, and transparent process that reflects and is responsive to the needs of the community. As you heard tonight, these two policies are foundational and incredibly important for our department, and we want to encourage as much public input as possible. From now until January 28, 2022, CPD will be seeking community input on its human rights policy and prohibition on racial profiling. And like Executive Director Boach spoke earlier, after the community engagement period concludes, CPD will conduct an analysis of the feedback provided and use it to inform the revisions of the policy. We anticipate publishing a draft of these policies as soon as we're able, and then we invite the community to come back and review the policies and provide additional feedback. Following the additional revisions, we hope and anticipate implementing the updated policies by June 30th, 2022. During this engagement period, we're offering up different opportunities for members of the public to get involved and provide that feedback. So I'm going to go through them, and which one you feel that you are most comfortable with, please participate. Tell your neighbors and your friends to do so as well. So number one is going to be public comment. Tomorrow morning, both of these policies will be posted on the CPD website. We'll ensure that the CPD website is in on the chat. We will accept your comments until January 28, 2022. Here, you will have the opportunity to review both of the current drafts of the policies and provide your feedbacks directly on them. The second form is going to be the input form or survey. We will launch two anonymous input forms that ask various questions around human rights and prohibition of profiling. Both of these surveys are currently open and accessible on CPD's website. The third is going to be the community conversation. The Chicago Police Department's Office of Community Policing will be conducting two virtual community conversations. These community conversations will be open to the general public and will give participants an opportunity to learn about the policies and provide feedback on them during the facilitation and discussion portion of the conversation. The first community conversation will take place December 14th on a Tuesday at 6:30 p.m. The second conversation will be Wednesday, January 19th at 6:30 p.m. We ask that you put it down on your calendar and join us. The last is going to be the deliberate dialogue. CPD is inviting community groups and organizations interested in providing feedback on the policies to meet with members of the Chicago Police Department's Office of Community Policing and the Office of Constitutional Policing and Reform. Deliberate dialogues involve representatives of various points of views in the community, including those who have been historically underrepresented in public forums. And we are aimed at understanding other perspectives on these important topics and challenges. These dialogues may not always produce a consensus at the end, but both groups would ideally understand the complexities in each of these issues and have a more informed opinion on them. Meetings will begin the week of November 29th, 2021, and will be offered until January 28th, 2022. Organizations interested in participating in the deliberative dialogue must sign up by January 10th, 2022. The sign-up form could also be found on CPD's webpage. And as a reminder, we will put that in the chat. Again, I'd like to close by thanking everybody who participates here tonight and encourage you to share your thoughts and feedback with us on these two policies. If you have any other questions or feedback you'd like to provide, please reach out to us by emailing us at community@chicagopolice.org. Thank you again for your willingness to help inform these policies. We look forward to hearing from you. These policies are foundational and incredibly important to us. So please, the more feedback we get, the more informed policies we can create. Thank you very much.
Deputy Chief Navalis, I've got one follow-up question for you right away. All right, so that first question is, are there opportunities for the public to help develop or even train officers on some of these topics that we covered tonight?
Well, as far as developing policies, this is a perfect start, right? And like I said earlier, public comment, input survey, community conversations, those are all opportunities to voice your opinion to help us shape our policies. We want to ensure that we create policies that are good for the people that it affects, not necessarily good for us, right? We want to create good policies that are good for the communities. The other thing, as far as training, you can reach out to us here at the Office of Community Policing. We have an opportunity for you to help train our officers on community policing training, and we would love to have you. It is a great opportunity put on by our Education and Training Division, which incorporates citizen input or citizen participation in our training. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to us here at the Office of Community Policing, the Chicago Police Department, and we will set you up to participate in that class.
All right, thank you, Deputy Chief. I've got other questions, but I'm going to pose them to the panel. So we will see who will jump up to answer these. So I'm just going to pose them to the panel. The first one is, have Chicago ever been under a consent decree before? Or is this the city's first one? I don't know who wants to jump in and answer that particular question.
That is a good question. I can tell you the city of Chicago has been under consent decree before. As far as the Chicago Police Department, I don't know the answer to that really. I mean, consent decrees are a tool of the federal government that in this particular case is designed to respond to a pattern and practice of certain behavior. In our case, the Department of Justice came in 2016 and determined that we had a pattern and practice of unconstitutional use of force. And so based on that report, we ultimately entered into negotiations and came to the consent decree agreement that we are now trying to implement. But I don't know for sure if the Chicago Police Department per se had been under consent decree. You know, I wouldn't know from 20, 25 years ago. I can tell you that in terms of the pattern and practice investigation perspective and the use of that tool from the Department of Justice really came about in the late 1990s. And has evolved dramatically over time. So ours is sort of the latest iteration of that evolution.
Thank you, Edie Boyd. We have another question about where this information tonight, particularly the slide deck. A lot of people are interested in the slide deck. I know Deputy Chief Navalis talked about how to get involved in the community policing page. Is that also where the slide deck would be if people were interested in getting a copy of it?
Mike Milstein, do you want to weigh in on this? I believe you put a link in the chat or maybe the Q&A, but just to verbally let everyone know, I think would be a good idea.
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone. Yes, so we will post either the slide deck itself or the exact same information from the slide deck on that same webpage that we shared in the chat. A lot of the information is already there, but we can make sure we add more of the exact information, as well as a background on the policies into on that webpage that was shared in the chat a little while ago.
Thank you, Mike. I've got a couple more questions. So one of the questions from the audience is, are there particular policies about how officers respond to someone having a mental health episode? I know we talked a little bit about ADA and persons with special needs and verbal or nonverbal adults or children, but this one specifically, is there a policy on how officers respond in that scenario?
I'll jump in and then ask Lieutenant Kapistanek to fill in any gaps that maybe I don't cover. The answer to that question is yes. In fact, we have a variety of policies related to this. And it's framed around our crisis intervention response teams, if you will, or our crisis intervention training. And we have a very specific crisis intervention course. It's a 40-hour course in which an officer can get certified in responding to individuals in crisis. And when an officer encounters someone who is in crisis, if they are not trained themselves, they can go over the radio and request an officer who does have that specific training to respond to the scene. In addition to that, however, if you do not have the 40-hour certification, we do train every officer on a routine basis to deal with individuals in mental health crisis. It's just that the 40-hour course gives you that special certification, and where possible, we want individuals with that certification responding to individuals in crisis.
Thank you, Edie Boyd. Lieutenant, I saw you came on. Did you want to add anything else, or are you okay with that answer?
No, that was, he pretty much covered everything, but there's a specific chapter in the consent decree specifically around dealing with individuals in crisis. And we have policies not only on our CIT trained officers, but for our officers in general to help recognize and respond to individuals in crisis. Those policies are independent of some of the other policies we've talked about, but they've been reviewed. We're continually revising those. Since it's part of the consent decree, we're working with the monitoring team and the Office of the Attorney General in developing that. But we also get guidance from the community for those as well. The Chicago Council on Mental Health Equity helps review those. They have subcommittees that review. So we have those policies. Those are constantly being looked at, reviewed, and revised based on best practices, not only what we see here in the city, but what we see nationwide.
Thank you, Lieutenant. That actually leads me to one of the other questions, and you might be the person to answer it or someone else on our panel, but one of the audience members asked about how does the police department decide or determine which policies are routinely reviewed? Is there some type of process that you go through?
So I will quickly turn this over to Lieutenant Kapistanek, but the answer is we do go through a regular review process of our policies. And I think I saw a similarly related question in the chat. A review of policy could be prompted by a number of things. It could be prompted by our own initiative. It could be prompted by an internal audit that has found some sort of deficiency. It could be prompted by an investigation from the Office of the Attorney General. It could be prompted by a change in best practice in law enforcement practices around the country. So there's a number of different triggers, if you will, that might prompt us to review a certain policy. In addition to that, the consent decree has a built-in review function as well for our policy, such that we have to constantly take a look, particularly at our major policies every 2 years, Beyond that, though, I'll turn it over to Lieutenant Kapistanic, who really has the job of conducting these reviews and can provide a more thorough explanation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Executive Director. You summed it up pretty well on where where a lot of those policies get initiated and some of those reviews get initiated. But any policy that comes through that we start reviewing, we go through that same type of process. We go through an internal types of needs assessment. We research best practices. We research academic literature. We research other agencies. There's police organizations that we look at. We look to see what's developing, what's emerging as best practices for those circumstances and for that particular topic. We go through that review. We talk to our subject matter experts. There's times where we reach out to outside subject matter experts, and then we develop a policy based on all of that. And then it goes through our internal review process. And as the Executive Director said, those associated with the consent decree go through another process with the IMT, the OAG, who also look at it from that perspective. And then, these conversations, I bring this up all the time on these conversations. I've had more of these conversations in the past year than I had in the rest of my 20-year career. And they're so valuable and beneficial to us as we're developing these policies. They get the perspective and the lived experience from the community on how we can better, as a department, be reflective of what you're seeing out there and what we can do to benefit you and benefit officers all at the same time. The goal ultimately, as we're reviewing these policies, is a clear, concise policy so that our officers could be easily trained on it, they can understand it, they can implement it, and then ultimately be held accountable based on the experiences of the community.
Thank you. Thank you, Lieutenant. We've got a couple more questions, and they're coming in pretty quickly here. So one of the questions is about someone witnessing. So you mentioned earlier about the ability of a citizen to videotape an officer and having the right to do so. The question is, if they witness an officer refusing to allow someone to videotape, how do they report that?
So there are a variety of ways in which a complaint can be initiated. You could, on the spot, request a supervisor to respond to that particular event. A supervisor is required to respond, and you could put forth that complaint to the supervisor directly. You could go into your local district station and log the complaint. You could contact the Civilian Office of Police Accountability. You could contact the Inspector General for the City of Chicago. You can do that, either by calling or I believe most of them have a portal through their website where you can log a complaint as well. So there really are a variety of ways in which to do it. They're all right. You can't go wrong with either one of them because they will all be funneled through the accountability system, and the appropriate entity will take that investigation. The vast majority of complaints are, they go through an intake process with the Civilian Office of Police Accountability. The only circumstance where that wouldn't be true is one in which it's logged with the Office of the Inspector General and they want to investigate that complaint independent of any other city entity.
Edie Boyk, you might as well just stay right on there because you almost answered the entire question, but I'm going to pose it anyway. Is there anyone who reviews the activities of officers? I think you just listed about 10 of them, but could you just restate that? So who reviews activities of officers?
So when we're talking about misconduct allegations, it could be, first of all allegations get funneled through the Civilian Office of Police Accountability. They then determine who will take on that investigation. In many cases, it is the Civilian Office of Police Accountability themselves, or they may turn it over to the Chicago Police Department's Bureau of Internal Affairs. And some of this is prescribed by city ordinance. The exception to that would be an Inspector General complaint that they receive directly and they decide to investigate themselves. So it's really those three entities, those three main entities that have jurisdiction to investigate misconduct.
Thank you so much. Lieutenant Kapistanik or Deputy Chief Navalis, I'm not sure who's going to get this one, but it says who's involved in conducting the reviews of policies and why isn't there an outside contractor involved? Anybody?
Lieutenant?
Like a Capistanik question.
All right.
Sure, I'll take that. We have specific policy analysts here in the Research and Development Division. We both have sworn officers, sworn supervisors, and civilian policy analysts that are specifically identified and trained to do this type of policy research and policy development. They kind of act, though, as the project managers for these reviews and these policy development, because honestly, you can't expect these officers to know everything about every topic when it comes to policing, but they are experts in research, they are experts in best practices, they are experts in doing that type of analysis. And we look at statistics, we look at other agencies, we look at how the current policies are being implemented here in Chicago. We're looking at all of that as we're developing the better policies, and we're looking to refine those policies. Outside contractor, I don't know if that's ever come up, but as of right now, that's a responsibility that falls on us here at Research and Development.
Thank you.
I will just add to that very briefly. We have had instances where individuals not from CPD are weighing in on policy and through the development phase. The issue is that we are required to generate and maintain a record of the changes that we make. So we do own the policy-making process within the police department, and it's largely to be able to create that historical record. You'd be surprised how many requests we get for policies from 30, 40 years ago that we are able to generate.
Thank you, BD. I've got another question. So I'm just going to pose this one to the panelists. I'm not sure who wants to answer this one, but what involvement does the FOP have in revising policies, and are they required to implement them?
So the city of Chicago is required to negotiate with the FOP around wages, working conditions. And so to the extent a policy is specific to working conditions, there may be an obligation for us to negotiate directly with the unions. That is not always the case, though. And in fact, I'd say it's not the case the majority of the time. Regardless of whether we have to negotiate a component of a working condition or not, the FOP, the sergeants, lieutenants, captains, unions are all subject to the same general orders, the same policy. So whenever the policy is promulgated by the department, everyone is equally held accountable to what is in that policy.
Thank you. Thank you, Edie Boyd. We've got one more question. Are there specific groups or organizations that you're looking for to engage with during this review process?
Deputy Navalis, do you want to take that?
You know what? Any group that is willing to provide a unique perspective on these policies is welcome. We want to ensure that all opinions are shared, all ideas are shared, and we're specifically looking for those marginalized groups that sometimes don't have their voices elevated. So if you're one of those groups and you want to participate, we will be more than happy to have you, and we welcome you aboard.
Thank you, Deputy Chief. We have time for one more question. And I just wanted to see if there's any. If not, I am going to close it out. If there is a question that didn't get answered, oftentimes the department will try to write some type of response that will also be posted with the webinar, the themes that have come out if we weren't able to answer your questions this evening. Thank you so much for all of the questions and the insight, and also for our panelists for sharing your time this evening. We really appreciate you, and most definitely we appreciate you, our audience, and for engaging with us and continuing to engage on policy review and community engagement in general. You can also email any questions at the email that Deputy Chief Navalis mentioned, as well as on the PowerPoint deck. You will also see that email. And then also on the reform site is where you will find the video as well as the information regarding the deck. So again, thank you so much for your time this evening. And we are going to close out this webinar, and thank you for coming and letting us go about 3 minutes early. So have a good evening, and we'll give you back those 3 minutes. Thank you again to my panelists, and thank you to our interpreter.
Thank you. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, everyone. Have a good
Everyone
night.
have a good night.